love it. Okay, we have one more reader to delight us all, and that is S.N.Arly. Please come up. Who's going to be reading from her new book, and it looks really cool. I'm really excited about it.
All right, I'm going to be reading from Something Familiar. It is a young adult novel about a witch in Paris who is looking for her familiar and a shapeshifter who has run away from home. Chapter 1. I know you're there. The man's voice was harsh and cold as Jacques remembered, and a jolt of fear shot through his chest, freezing him as surely as a binding spell. You may as well come out now. You can't defy me or my magic, and if you cooperate, I may feel gracious when assigning your punishment. Jacques had been hopeful at first. While his father had alerted the police and media of his son's appearance, he had left out a fairly significant detail regarding Jacques' nature. And now the man was walking the neighborhood of the streets of the 14th arrondissement alone and in the dark. He still didn't want anyone to find out. He thought he could bide his time and use others' magic to bring Jacques to heel. He knew nothing of cats. For the last 4 months, Jacques had lived as a stray cat on the streets of Paris. It may not have been the easiest life, but it was 1,000 times better than living with his all-too-human father. He would rather die than go back to being a prisoner in that house, denied the opportunity to be what he really was. He wasn't sure how his father had found him. Pierre Peranteau was a gifted designer, but a mediocre magic user. He relied on other people's spells and enchantments to get his way, but he was successful and wealthy, and he probably purchased a locating talisman this time. Jacques suspected there were ways to inhibit such tools from finding him, but he had no way of learning this for himself. His magic education involved being on the receiving end of his father's personal or bought enchantments and charms. Jacques closed his brilliant green eyes and tapped into his feline nature. Leaning on his human logic and education had helped him get by quite well, really. But thinking like a 16-year-old runaway boy was not going to get him out of this. Settling all 4 paws on the moss-covered cobblestone sidewalk, he peered out from behind the large planter. As a black cat, the night was his time. As a committed stray, the back streets and rooftops were his place. His father could not catch him here. He embraced his instinct, tempered it with logic, and simply felt when the opportune moment hit. He darted out, bounding down the street to a thickly vine-covered trellis. "Stop!" his father ordered. Jacques scaled the vines, scampering across them where they spanned the width of the street. He growled as he passed directly over his father to a nearby roof. Twice he felt a very faint tug, as if his father was reaching for the old bonds Jacques spent every day eroding. His own magic was minimal, most of it related to shape-shifting, but his time on the street had shown him that if he worked at it, he had the ability to curse things with misfortune. The triggers for his father's compulsion spells were his first experiments. They were in tatters at this point, barely present enough to notice. He reached the roof just in time for his father to throw a compact spell at him. His aim was worse than his magic, and it missed. Jacques hissed at the explosion of gold sparks, spitting out the cat equivalent of "fuck you." He kept his distance from the newly conjured cage, on the off chance that his father had purchased more of those, and that his first shot had been merely unlucky. Jacques scrambled away from the edge of the roof so he wouldn't be vulnerable to ground attacks. This was the second time his father had found him, and he'd clearly stepped up his game. Jacques was going to need to rethink his situation to prevent a third opportunity. Chapter 2. Brigitte sat on a low curb between the cobbled street and sidewalk. Her black braids hung over her shoulders to dangle between her knees as she stared at the moss under her feet. She didn't want to admit it to anyone, but she was beginning to feel more than a little disappointed. She'd waited much longer than any of her witch-born friends to find her familiar. Most got their familiars at 14, and her cousins in China had theirs by 13. Yet here she was, 16, and completely devoid of a familiar. It was getting a little embarrassing, but she'd wanted to be sure she was ready for the commitment of a permanent bond. Everything she'd read suggested this would ultimately give her and her familiar a stronger and more satisfying connection. But finding her cat wasn't going well at all. Instead of picking a random purebred or pet store kitten, her magic wanted her to select a stray, and that there needed to be a connection when they met. Maybe she was being too difficult. She'd started her search on the streets near her parents' boulangerie, patisserie, and kosher shop in the 13 arrondissement, without any luck. Master Fu, who was both a regular customer at the shop and a good friend of her maman's, suggested she look near his acupuncture parlor. He'd been visited several times by a black cat that he thought would be a good fit. He insisted the Tom was young enough to be flexible and that he didn't belong to anyone despite his sweet temperament. He'd also said something about matching qi and other conditions considered favorable by Chinese rich-born. She'd searched the entire Chinese quarter without spotting a free cat, much less any that were black. Either Master Fu's Tom had moved on or he'd been picked up already. The witch population of Paris was not small, and it was public knowledge that cats without an obvious claim were considered fair game.